I'm hearing more and more people say the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts.
Older men were using Grand Theft Auto 3 as a murder and carjacking simulator.
The amount of violence is increasingly realistic, increasingly graphic.
Games where murdering men, women, and police officers is the whole objective.
Simulated violence.
Criminal simulator, murder simulator.
Through vicious, violent video games.
They see increasingly violent media.
These video games that dehumanize individuals to have a game of shooting individuals and others.
And when I began to become aware of how we teach soldiers and cops, how we have to condition them to be able to pull the trigger, to overcome the resistance, we realized that video games doing the same things to the kids.
Stop me if you've heard this one before. The youths of today are violent and antisocial, and violent video games are to blame. This is a discussion that has flared up again and again for over 30 years now. Initially driven mainly by moralists of various flavors.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
And today driven mainly by the American gun lobby? That can't be right.
Vicious, violent video games with names like Bulletstorm.
Alright then. We've all heard about games making people violent so many times by now that mostly it's just met with a collective sigh.
The best video games.
Today it's Donald Trump, in the aughts it was Jack Thompson, and before that it was politicians like Joe Lieberman. We've heard about it before video games were even a thing, but then about specific types of movies and music. We're simply tired of the whole thing, and anytime it comes back, the gaming community tends to respond with a mix of indignation and mockery. A few spicy opinion pieces calling the latest alarmist a crusty clown shoe, and then we move on without really taking the discussion seriously. I've done this myself more than once and defended it by saying that there is nothing to be gained from having a serious debate with someone who isn't arguing in good faith. Which, to be clear, is something that I really do believe. Jack Thompson, for example, was a lying asshat and shouldn't be taken seriously in the slightest. And when Trump and his ilk start discussing the role of games in mass shootings, it's just a smokescreen to get out of talking about gun regulations and how Trump's rhetoric encourages right-wing extremism. And there is no value in trying to hold a serious debate with someone who is uninformed, lying, or uninterested in talking about what they claim to want to talk about. But I think the fact that the people who have been pushing the issue of violent games have been so obviously wrong has gotten in the way of an actually interesting conversation. And I think it's time we stop letting those people set the agenda. So, with the risk of making enemies on both sides, let's have a fucking discussion about violence in video games. Part 1. Yeah, but nah. When I've entered into this discussion in the past, I've done so with a number of prepared arguments up my sleeve. Arguments that I feel one by one have started to lose their appeal. The arguments are a bit difficult to separate into wholly distinct points, but I've tried to break out a couple of specific recurring phrases and taken a closer look at why they might not be as convincing as I previously thought.
Culture shouldn't be censored. People should be allowed to make their own choices about what they consume.
This is an argument that's distinct from the others in that it completely ignores the question, do games make people violent, and instead goes directly to the question of what we should do if that is the case. And responds to that question with, nothing. Do games make people violent? It doesn't matter. We shouldn't do anything about it. And that is a very consistent argument that I think most of us agree with, at least to some extent. We shouldn't censor culture, free speech is paramount, and so on. But here we tend to get stuck in absolutes. Maybe there are more options than just state-sanctioned censorship and complete freedom to release whatever you want for consumption. maybe there's some sort of middle ground, and maybe there's a discussion to be had even if we don't want censorship. Like some sort of cultural criticism?
It stinks.
People can tell the difference between reality and fiction.
This argument is as common as it is unconvincing. It's a reply to an argument that nobody, at least nobody reasonable, is making. Telling reality from fiction is something that the absolute majority of people have the ability to do. But just because you know that something isn't real, that doesn't mean it has no effect on you. And if it is just a question of telling reality from fiction, then we also neutralize any discussions about, for example, sexism and racism. What does it matter if women are systematically marginalized in video games if it's all just fiction and doesn't affect people at all?
But what about books and movies? People committing violent acts may just as well be affected by those.
This argument can be shot down pretty quickly in two different ways. The first is that games, as opposed to books and movies, are interactive, meaning they could very well affect people in completely unique ways. The other is that maybe books and movies also make people violent. That's not an argument against games doing so.
Playing violent games acts as a sort of catharsis. It makes people less violent.
Catharsis is a concept from ancient Greece that says that we can work through negative emotions by experiencing them in a fictional form. A modified version of the concept has later been adapted by certain branches of psychology. And it's a compelling idea that at first glance feels reasonable. Haven't we all felt the calm that comes from crying to a sad movie? The evidence backing this hypothesis in regards to games is, however, shaky at best. It seems more like something people say because they've heard someone else say it and it sounds good than because there is anything substantial supporting it. Which brings us to the last argument.
Look at the science. There's no evidence that games make people violent.
And sure, let's look at Part 2, the science. This is what I originally planned to do a deep dive into. The scientists have scienced, the science is done, but what exactly does it say? What I pretty quickly realized though was, science is tricky. We all like it and like to at least seem like we're looking at the world through a scientific lens where facts dictate what we think and believe. But the truth is that many questions are harder to answer scientifically than we would like to believe. And this question is a great example of why that is. Firstly, do violent games make people more violent is a pretty poorly formulated question from a scientific point of view. It contains a lot of ill-defined parts. What is a violent game? What people? What does it mean to become more violent? In this video I'll be talking both about violence and about aggression, so I thought I'd try to clarify what sets them apart and where they overlap. It's a little tricky to establish exact definitions of the words since their colloquial use is very different from how they're used in academic research, and the definitions can even differ between different scientific fields. But I can tell you how I will be using them. Aggression is a directed form of anger, where the anger takes the form of hostile and confrontational behavior. In its most extreme form, aggression expresses itself through violence, which is when the confrontational behavior leads to someone getting hurt.
Please proceed with aggression.
Then there is a methodological issue. In order to answer a question, scientists need to concoct a method for doing so. An experiment, so to speak, which will yield the answer. And that isn't the easiest thing in the world when what you're examining is human behavior. How do we find neutral test subjects? What game or games should they play and under what circumstances? How do we measure their level of violence to determine if it's changed? What sample size do we need? Do we need a control group that only plays nerd games for nerds? Then there's the ethics question. Even if we don't believe that games do make people violent, can we really do an experiment where we expose people to something that might potentially affect their brains negatively? Especially considering that it's mainly kids who are said to be affected. This is just a small sampling of the many issues we face when trying to study violent games and their effects on humans, and that's why the answer we get from science mostly boils down to,
how should I know? I'm a dentist!
No matter what you believe, you can find studies supporting your side, and in contrast to many other topics, it's not always clear which side tends to have the clearest hypothesis and most robust methodology. In 2003, a study was done on the effects of video games on 100 4th and 5th graders at the University of Toledo, Ohio. The study showed that playing video games resulted in lower empathy and a higher tendency for violence. That same year, a study from the University of Leicester showed that violent games resulted in lower aggression in Japanese adolescents. Those were just 2 studies, but they were made in the same year and had completely contradictory results, which must mean that one or both of the studies were wrong. Or does it? Well, not quite. Both studies had way too many variables to be directly comparable, even if they were, on a surface level, about the same thing. Both studies consisted of surveys, where the kids got to estimate their consumption of different types of media, and then got to answer questions meant to show their level of aggression. I'm not saying surveys aren't a legitimate way to conduct a study, but in this case it's hard to base any broader conclusions on either study. Maybe there were factors that caused the kids to over or underestimate their actual consumption. Maybe questions like people with guns or knives are cool aren't a conclusive way of measuring a person's empathy. But okay, fuck surveys, let's do some cold, hard science. A 2007 study from multiple universities measured the bodily reactions of 257 participants as they watched violent videos before and after having played both violent and non-violent games. The study concluded that people who had been exposed to violent games became less sensitive to violent imagery, which, while not directly showing that violent games make people violent, does seem to give a certain indication. The study also confirmed the results from a study performed 2 years earlier. Okay, just a quick side note. The violent games they had participants play were Carmageddon, Duke Nukem Forever, Mortal Kombat, and Future Cop? And the non-violent games were Glider Pro, 3D Pinball, 3D Munchman, and Tetra Madness, which is a wild mix of games which they do not specify how they arrived at, and of which 2 games do not even exist. 3D Munchman could either refer to the Pac-Man clone Munchman, or to the Pac-Man clone 3D Maze Man, or to the sequel to 3D Maze Man, 3D Munchman 2. And Tetra Madness is maybe Tetris? Or Marble Madness? I'm not saying the results of the study are less trustworthy just because they couldn't write the game titles correctly, but they are. Another study that came out the same year from Swinburne University of Technology got a different result. Now, they didn't measure neither pulse nor galvanic response, instead using surveys again, but they let their subjects play 20 minutes of Quake 2? Okay, what's the deal with the ancient games? Did the people in charge of the studies not know any teens they could ask about what games are actually being played right now? Anyways, their study showed that some kids got more aggressive from violent games, while others got less aggressive, and overall their conclusion was that it kind of depends on how you are as a person. In 2005, the APA, American Psychological Association, came out hard against video games, saying that playing violent video games led to, among other things, increased aggression and anger, and that games containing sexual violence were linked to increased misogyny and violence against women, as well as greater tendencies to believe in myths about rape. That was in turn met by criticism from multiple sources, and in 2013, 230 media scholars came out and asked the APA to revise their standpoint. Which they did in 2015 when they concluded that there was no proven link between violent games and violent crimes, while still standing by the opinion that they did lead to violent tendencies. Here we have 2 interesting points to take a closer look at. The first is the question of sexual violence and misogyny, which is an entire subject in itself that I don't really feel like I can adequately dive into here and now. And the other point is the one about the crimes. Because there are several studies that have focused on the correlation between the sales of games and crime statistics, something that was mentioned in, among other places, Adam Ruins Everything.
As video game sales in America have spiked, violent crime has actually gone down.
What this argument doesn't consider is what kind of games are being played and what types of violent crimes are falling. If gaming is going up because more people are playing The Sims, or violent crimes are going down because fewer robberies are committed, that's a pretty poor indicator of what effect violent games have on violent crimes. I'm not saying that these statistics are wrong, or even that the conclusion is, just that the conclusion isn't really backed up by the statistics in question. And to be very clear, I am myself extremely doubtful that violent games can be said to have any real effect on the prevalence of violent crimes. There is very little real evidence of this, and as a social analysis it feels somewhat lacking. All I'm saying is that correlation is not the same thing as causation. This hasn't been the in-depth meta-analysis of the science that I had hoped when I started out this video. I really thought I'd sit down, look at a bunch of studies and find out who was right. What I did find out was that this is the entirely wrong question to be asking. I'm not going to claim that it's impossible to hammer out a more complete picture of how the consumption of interactive media affects people, or that it's not possible to at least in part answer the question by examining smaller parts of it from different angles. But centering the debate around the question, do violent games make people more violent, is reductive, incurious, and short-sighted. Part 3. We live in a society. The idea that the media we consume is like a liquid being poured straight into our brain containers has long since gone out of fashion in media studies and been replaced with more nuanced theories about media's part in shaping our worldview. There are still many points of contention about how exactly it works, but generally speaking, everyone agrees that neither individual people or society at large are unaffected by media, but they also don't completely change their thoughts and opinions based on what they consume. Thus, do violent games make people more violent is a pretty outdated question. The question as it is posed separates video games from all other forms of culture and treats violence in them as if it more or less causes an injury to the brain of the player. A more relevant discussion to have would be one about how our society as a whole sees and treats violence and how that affects people. Even if the last chapter might have made it sound as if it's hard to find any science whatsoever to lean on in discussions on why aggression in people occurs, that's not the case. Science concerning games might leave some things to be desired, but that's not necessarily true for all science about social cognitive learning, which is the nerd-ass way of saying learning through observation. One of the most famous and most influential studies in the field is Albert Bandura's Bobo doll experiment. In the study, which was performed in the 60s, a group of kids between the ages of 37 and 69 nice months got to play with an inflatable clown doll. This wasn't done just to entertain them, but to examine how their behavior was affected when they got to observe an adult acting aggressive first. What the study showed was that kids that got to see aggressive behavior then replicated similar behavior towards the poor doll, which challenged the dominant view on learning at the time. What Bandura's study showed was that humans are affected by and learn from our environment, something that, when said out loud, sounds really fucking obvious. The jump from a child watching an adult acting aggressive and adults playing a video game with characters there are is of course pretty big, and it's always dangerous to apply results from studies too broadly. However, since the 60s, several more studies have been done on the topic, and they all point in the same direction. Some even go as far as claiming that neurologically, there is very little difference between seeing an action performed and performing it yourself. Another thing that's been studied repeatedly through the years is what effect seeing and handling guns has on people. And pretty much every study has reached the same conclusion, that it's not even necessary for people to fire a gun for it to increase their levels of aggression. In a study performed in 2006, a number of test subjects had to leave samples of their saliva before and after handling either a children's toy or a replica of a gun for 15 minutes. Measuring the levels of testosterone in the samples showed a marked increase of it in the people who handled the gun. But the study didn't end there, as the subjects then were tasked with pouring hot sauce in a glass of water that they were told another subject would have to drink. And the results showed that those who handled the weapon tended to pour in more sauce than those who handled the toy. And before you ask, hot sauce is an established method in psychology for measuring aggression. It wasn't that the scientists wanted to get data specifically about Tabasco. None of these studies straight up show that games cause violent behavior. And that's not what I'm trying to prove, since I don't believe it can be proven. But that doesn't mean there's nothing to discuss. Playing games with guns might not turn people into mass shooters just like that, but maybe the relationship between playing violent games and becoming violent doesn't have to be one-to-one for it to be worth asking certain questions about how violence is depicted in games. Let's focus for a moment specifically on guns. Guns are cool. In our culture, guns are something very cool that very cool people use to do very cool things. Even people who in reality are strongly anti-gun can cheer wildly when John Wick goes ham on the Russian mafia.
I'm sick and tired of real-life gun violence getting in the way of us telling stories that glamorize gun violence.
So without making a bananas claim like video games turned someone into a school shooter, can we really deny that the broader societal view on guns probably had an effect on the people who commit school shootings? Before you pop a vein and write an angry comment about how I think video games cause school shootings, even though that's not at all what I said, let's talk about some people who absolutely think that games affect our view of guns. People who make guns. Just like you're not allowed to put any existing car in a car game without the permission of the manufacturer, you can't just throw an existing weapon model in a game willy-nilly. You have to talk to the gun manufacturer. And they won't agree if they don't think that it will reflect well on them. This has actually changed a bit during the last few years after EA decided to stop licensing guns since it was a bad look. Most developers now use guns that are similar to real guns without being actual existing models. The exact legality of using a trademarked weapon is currently not entirely clear, as it's never been tried in a court of law, since weapon manufacturers don't want the games industry to stop marketing their guns for them. That video games can act as great marketing for guns shouldn't be any more controversial than that cool characters smoking cigarettes in movies have been great marketing for the tobacco industry. And again, before you write an angry comment about how it's people who kill and not guns, I want to point out that people who want to kill people often are markedly more successful if they happen to have access to a tool specifically made for that purpose. Kind of how a hammer doesn't hammer nails on its own, but makes it a hell of a lot easier to beat someone to death. Gun manufacturers are also not the only ones who seem to believe that games are a good way of affecting people. We also have, for example, the military. Political and military propaganda is a subject all of its own, but the fact that games to such a large degree feature problem solving through violence is not affected by very ingrained ideas and trends, both indirectly and very directly. Considering all of this, it would be scientifically irresponsible to conclude that violent games do not cause aggression, or even to say that we don't know. It very much looks like games can cause increased aggression. Hold your horses. I'm not saying video games create violent serial killers, and I'm not saying games are bad or that you are bad TM for playing them. All I'm saying is, our experiences have an effect on us, what we see, what we consume. This shouldn't even be a controversial thing to say. That it has become controversial is largely due to how gaming has been singled out as uniquely terrible. I'm sorry to say this, but video games aren't some unique, special snowflake. Video games are, if anything, the medium that is most likely to follow in the footsteps of others. They rarely go where film and literature haven't already been, for the simple reason that it's a younger type of media. And gratuitous violence? That's something cinemas had their flag firmly planted in for a long time. Hollywood has been an extremely willing collaborator with the US military for decades. The American military has likely been involved in the production of more than one of your favorite movies. And studios don't get to borrow military equipment and vehicles because the generals are feeling generous. As I said before, but what about movies isn't a good argument in the debate, does playing video games make you violent? But it is a good argument in the debate, do people become more violent playing video games than they would have doing something else? Because games aren't just some polygonal cherry placed on top of people's already fixed lives. Like all things, they occupy a part of those lives. If we assume that all people who currently play Call of Duty would instead start meditating peacefully if Call of Duty didn't exist, then we could pretty confidently claim that Call of Duty does increase aggression. But that's not the case, because we live in a society, and in this society, Call of Duty would likely have been replaced with some other activity. Maybe some of the players would have started doing sports. Better for your cardio maybe, but not necessarily for your aggression. Violent sports have been linked to aggression both in those who play them and those who like to watch. And my apologies to Michael Moore, music can also be linked to an increase in aggression. Factors that can increase aggression surround us everywhere we go, so the fact that video games also do isn't some breaking story or damning evidence that video games are bad for you. Hold off on the celebration gamers, this isn't me giving video games a free pass, we have more to discuss. There's still a lot to criticize about how games handle violence, even if everyone's doing it. But it's still a good idea to keep the rest of our culture in mind, since it could be a good way to tell whether a person talking about violence in video games actually has an interest in seriously discussing the matter, or if they're driven by an alternative agenda. Do they bring up a larger cultural context at all? Do they critique other expressions of violence in culture? Someone criticizing violence in video games genuinely should reasonably know that nothing exists in a vacuum, that the ideas presented in video games weren't pulled from thin air. Let's say, for an example, that an organization who talks about how harmful violent video games are also produced something like this. Then it might be time to start asking to what extent they might just be, scientifically speaking, full of shit. Okay, I think it's time to look at this problem from a different angle. Time for Part 4. Trigger warning. To all of you out there who are triggered by trigger warnings, take a deep breath because this is going to be a rough one. We begin with the following statement. The privilege of being entertained by fictional violence is almost entirely exclusive to those who have never personally experienced that violence. To center the discussion of violent media on how the people who are entertained by it may or may not be affected is more than a little limiting. That our entire media landscape is steeped in graphic violence also has an effect on those who have been through actual, real violence, and because of that might not find fictional violence quite as entertaining. The often criticized concept trigger warning literally exists to warn people who are traumatized of material that could trigger their PTSD. The whole concept has been repeatedly criticized with the argument that trigger warnings are just a way of hiding from reality, when those who need trigger warnings need them specifically because they've faced the real world to a much greater extent than most of the critics have. Of course, some pubescent suburban kid whose mom still buys his t-shirts can revel in explicit graphic violence. The closest thing he's ever been to a truly violent experience was when he punched a wall because his dad unplugged the router in the middle of a Fortnite game. But unless you lack any and all basic human decency, maybe you could try not being an edgelord and instead empathize with someone else's fucking experience. The other year, news broke that one of the developers of Mortal Kombat 11 had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress after having been exposed to a large amount of graphic violence. To be fair, the worst of what the developer saw wasn't animations from the actual game, but reference material, but this is still a pretty serious indicator that exposure to these kinds of extreme images has an effect. The effect in this case was clearly not somebody becoming violent, but rather the images themselves doing violence. And that is an effect that gets completely swept under the rug if discussions of violence in video games begin and end at does it make people violent? Part 5. When all you have is a shotgun, everything looks like a target. When I played through the latest Gears of War, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that the flashy violence was a bit pointless. What was the purpose of showing the mutilation of characters in such explicit detail? What was it supposed to make me feel? If anything, it kind of took away from the experience when the game was on one hand trying to say something about the horrors of war, and on the other wanted to show how cool it is to do a chainsaw murder. If a game's mechanics wouldn't meaningfully change by switching the bullets for paintballs, then the reason for the violence has to be in the narrative. But how often is the violence really there to improve the story? Sure, it'd be hard to make a game about World War II where soldiers cover each other in paint, but how much of the violence in games about World War II is really there to convey the experience of war? Realism is a term that gets thrown around a lot in these discussions. But the truth is, we don't want a realistic portrayal of war when we play video games. It would suck. You can't make a game about war that is both fun and realistic. You can either make a guns are cool game about no-scoping Nazis, or you can make a game that depicts war realistically, but you have to choose. Because having to amputate your buddy's leg in a muddy trench because of an infected bullet wound is nobody's idea of a hot and sexy power fantasy. People are always trying to turn this into a question of censorship, but is it really? The question isn't what you're allowed to do with a game, but what you ought to do and why. Sure, games can be however violent its creators want it to be, but we have to ask ourselves, to what end? What's the purpose of it? Shock value? If so, there are easier ways. People are offended by anything these days. Just look at the people boycotting a game about a goose because the credits were too PC. Now, I'm not saying that I can't appreciate a little fictional violence here and there, but lately I feel it tends to leave somewhat of a bitter aftertaste. I think that I, like many others, kind of fell into defending any and all types of violence in video games just because the people arguing against it are such absolute dweebs. But it's become kinda like with Manly Men and Hot Sauce. It doesn't matter anymore if it actually adds anything, you just don't want to be the guy who says it's too much. I don't think looking for a precise answer to the question of how playing violent video games affects people is gonna lead to a satisfying resolution to this debate. And I don't think that it's even the debate we should be having. We live in a pretty fucking hyper-violent culture, and we need to examine every expression of that culture. But I make videos about games, and the question I'm asking is, how much do we want to contribute to it? Hi, hello, thank you for watching my video. It's my first and maybe last real video in English. I actually made two versions of the video, one in English and one in Swedish, because I spent so goddamn much time on it that I want to see if I could get some more people to see it, so thank you for seeing it. During the making of this video, my microphone broke twice, and just as I was finishing up, a hard drive containing a bunch of the video material died, so it's been an experience, and I'm very glad to be done. I want to thank my amazing partner who helped me write, translate, and produce this video. Also, thanks to our patrons for making this possible. Without them, I couldn't have bought the many games I played to get the footage to make this video. Thank you.